everybody. I'm Britta, and this is Ben, and we are the Desk Chair Philosophy Podcast. We're just a couple dorks just hanging out and having some cool conversations. Today we'll be talking about some video games, and we have some questions about, why do video games cost so much, Ben? What's up with that?
So there's actually a very interesting sort of two parts to the answer of that question. One, video games are actually not following inflation, which is one of the more interesting sides of this whole conversation, where if we actually looked at adjusted for inflation, like even in 2022, a game that you would have bought in about 1996 would have actually been $98, which that's absurd. And that's the crazy thing. We don't think about how inflation actually affects these prices, because the average video game costs about $60. It's slowly creeping up to $70, but there's actually several graphs, charts, research that supports the fact that by inflation, video games actually cost less lately than they did in the past if we're talking about base box prices.
Yeah.
But that's where we get into the other forms of monetization, as well as usually a game is not as complete as it might be historically, because now we can patch, we can add on DLC, we can add on expansions, just all sorts of things that we have been able to do. But the reality is that they cost less than they should, and they actually have been making up that difference by increasing the player base that people are actually trying to attract. And we're talking mainly AAA games, because of course you can always find indie games that range from prices of $1 to, I think that the largest priced indie game was like $10,000, which is I'm pretty sure it's pretty more than anything else.
Wait, what was that?
I think it was more of a scam than an actual game, but I didn't buy it to find out.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, there's a lot of range actually there.
Very interesting. So I remember when I was a teenager and I would save up my $40 to go buy a brand new game at the time, and I when you mentioned the inflation, I hadn't thought about whoa, that hasn't quite. So do you think that they kind of try to make that up with DLC a little bit too, because it kind of adds to the cost to make it more, but at the same time you're adding more content? Does that help at all with the system?
Yeah, DLCs, expansions, they've always been proven to make more money. It's kind of like releasing a sequel for a movie. Usually you know that a sequel is going to it's going to appeal to a specific fan base that you already established. With video games, that's almost even more true, because while you watch a movie, you watch that movie once, twice, 10 times before the sequel comes out. 10 times seems like a lot. Yeah. You play a video game, you could be playing it until the expansion comes out. Yeah. You could be playing it for hundreds and hundreds of hours.
Yeah.
Until the expansion comes out, which means that they know they can track those, especially nowadays. They can track those metrics, they can track the sales metrics, and they know there is a dedicated fan base that's playing this game. Mm-hmm. So if we release a DLC, an expansion, whatever, there's probably, even if they said on the more conservative side, or 50% of the people are going to buy it, they already know that's a larger chunk of change. They know where to focus their development in getting people to buy those games. It's the same reason why we see now microtransactions. It's the same idea, just focused through a different lens, a different monetization practice.
Yeah. So is there a positive to microtransactions? Because I almost feel like when you think about microtransactions, especially with, I don't know why it comes in my brain, but Bethesda, I know that they were one of the first people to release DLC in the first place with horse armor or something, and then they have all these mobile games, and I'm just waiting for Elder Scrolls 6 here, you know what I mean? But I get scared to buy it, because you saw Starfield, and I don't know what your thoughts are on Starfield, but I wasn't excited about that, because I was just I'm just waiting for the spaceship armor DLC.
Spaceship armor. Yes, it's just a bunch of horses.
Yeah.
No, I honestly, I don't have much to say about Starfield, because it did not appeal to me, because I kind of knew what to expect. Unfortunately, I'm not as much of a fan of the Bethesda products as I was back in the day. I loved Oblivion. I absolutely adored Skyrim for a little while, but at a certain point when I was playing Skyrim, I realized it was when they released one of the patches where they recoded in specific mods into the base game, which then broke the mod library that I had established over the years that exactly. Oh no! But the reality is, everyone knows that feeling who's played a Bethesda game, and it's the thing that triggered it into my head and made me realize I don't like Skyrim that much. I like this modded version of Skyrim that I have created and curated. Right. And when they added a bunch of stuff that I didn't want, it ruined my experience. Not only it ruined my experience because I have to redo all my mods, but it was also, I was looking at it saying, like, I don't even want this stuff. Which, that's something that...
chocolate chip with strawberry, not vanilla. You know? I get it.
I mean, that's kind of how Skyrim works. It is a sort of a la carte game to an extent because they allow you to do the mods, but all the stuff that you're getting as toppings, you have to get from separate shops, which is the weird thing about it because none of them communicate. So it's like, yeah, I want a chocolate chip cookie with chocolate frosting and then like a little whipped cream on top. But instead what you get is like the whipped cream's on the bottom, the chocolate chip cookie goes on top of that, and the frosting is kind of done in a zigzag. And it's like, well, it's kind of what I wanted, but not quite. And this is ultimately my issue with their game. So I didn't ever really pick up Starfield. So I don't have much to say about that. But on the side of actually how microtransactions work in gaming today and if they actually benefit the industry / benefit the players, they do not benefit the players. Yeah. The reality is microtransactions do not directly benefit the players. I will say, I'll add directly there because they indirectly benefit the players in that they fund the studios.
Yes.
Which sometimes it's a little hard to think of it in that same sort of mindset of like, oh, what I'm doing, what I'm spending money on is funding these studios that I want to exist. Yeah. Now, in most cases, I'm not a big fan of microtransactions. There is a reason I have to say most cases, because there is one game that I absolutely love that thrives only on microtransactions, and that's Path of Exile. Oh, okay. It's a game that is completely free, but I have spent several $100s on it. Mm-hmm. The microtransactions are all cosmetic, which there's a whole thing to be said for cosmetic microtransactions versus any sort of mechanical microtransactions. Yeah. I prefer cosmetic microtransactions because the whole point of playing a game is playing a game, and if you have mechanics involved in your microtransactions, that's immediately going to be incentivizing any developer to slow drip feed the actual content and put it behind paywalls. Yes. Which, again, that's a detriment to players. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
There was a few things. So, like that's, I had that mindset too. Like where you put your dollar, that's what you are saying. Like, hey, yes, hi, notice me, please, make more of this. But at the same time, it's like, you think like, yes, okay, Naughty Dog, I'm supporting Naughty Dog, and it's all of those employees, but that doesn't necessarily always mean that. So is there a way to tell with support, like, are you ever going to be able to support all the little ones? I know indie games, that kind of works a little bit because they're way smaller and they're more like there's 3 people working on this game, and then the game blows up and then they get like 60 employees and then it like grows that way, versus like Ubisoft, where it's just like they started great, and in Assassin's Creed 1 they removed the crossbow because it wasn't logical enough for the time period, and now they have like everything's insane. So
space wizards, and
there's a lot that I just like threw out the wall there, but I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
Okay, so I'm going to tackle this. I'm going to tackle this actually tangent first, which is the backwards way to do it. Speaking of Ubisoft and their decision to focus on what is it? Historical accuracy, yes. Quote unquote.
Real thing. That is like so true.
I appreciate some levels of them trying to bring these eras back to life. Mm-hmm. But I am so tired of this half-in, half-out nonsense that they're doing. And again, to bring up like an additional game, like the game that made me realize that I was tired of it was Shadow of War and Shadow of Mordor. because it's Assassin's Creed, but just set in an entirely fantasy setting where I don't have to worry about all this, like, oh, well, maybe this is actually the story we're doing, and we're doing about these alien progenitors / conspiracy theories. Like, that's all fine. I like that aspect of Ubisoft, but then they're also like, oh, but strictly, we're not going to allow you to use these elements of the gameplay. We're just going to do these cool stuff off screen. It's like, great, but also I want to be a part of those things that you keep showing me, which is why I'm playing the game.
Exactly.
Like, I honestly, when I first played the original Assassin's Creed, I thought we were going to get a Desmond, like, actually playable Desmond game where you're playing as the main character of the game. And then he died before you really got to play him as an assassin.
I just started.
I know, okay, yeah, I guess I should have said spoilers,
but it's been out since 2007. It's fine.
But the whole point being, like, I really wish they would commit to something, to doing something or other.
Yes.
The problem there, though, now moving back to the original point of the how do you spend your money correctly in that kind of environment?
Yeah.
It's a little bit easy to tell with Ubisoft because Ubisoft is just trying to monetize everything. You look at Valhalla. Valhalla was the Assassin's Creed that should have appealed to me the most, and in many ways it did.
Yeah.
But the constant barrage of microtransactions that were mechanical microtransactions, cosmetic microtransactions, predatory microtransactions that they used a different currency to buy the other microtransactions. So you had to buy
after you in your assassin game.
Yeah, and it's just you have to buy this currency in order to buy the cosmetic that you actually wanted, but the cosmetic also has mechanical elements, and it's just this shell game they're playing with your money in order to make you spend more money. And it's very obvious that that's what they're doing. Well, not very, but it's more obvious that that's what they're doing. The biggest tell for any of these studios, for any of these games, of whether or not you're actually spending your money to support the developer or to just let the company throw your money at the CEO, at the C-level employees, is really how much money are they making? How much money are they making? How are they treating their employees? And it's a little hard to try and keep track.
The company or the game itself?
The game itself, the company, and then the employees. Those are the three metrics that you have to kind of look for. Like, if the company's making tons of money but the game's not doing well, spending a little extra money on it shows them that there's interest, that you want that game to continue. There's no guarantee that it will, because again, they're going to be paying attention to what's making the most money. But if if you've got a game that's kind of on life support but not really, and you spend a little bit more money on it, it might perk up a little bit of corporate interest, unfortunately. I say unfortunately only because, unfortunately, corporate, because that's how those studios all work. They are corporate.
Totally. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
So, like, if you, I'm trying to think about what I'm trying to say. If there's, like, does it make a difference for, like, how do you, like, if you have an indie game that's, like, brand new, nobody knows about it, there's a AAA game that you want, but it's like a retired series that's been forever, or a remake. What should you spend your money on if you want to play all three games? Like, is there a way to know
there's
how to
a brand new game, a remake, and an old classic game.
But it's like Assassin's Creed 57.
So that's really going to depend on, like, what kind of content you want to see more of. That's always where it goes to, is what kind of content do you want to see more of. If we're using more realistic terms, let's try and compare three games that are of similar origins, or of similar genres rather. We're going to go ahead, just because this is easiest for me.
Sure.
I'm a huge action RPG fan. We've got Diablo 4, we've got Last Epoch, and we've got Path of Exile. So two of those are from an indie studio. So, like, Path of Exile is pseudo indie studio at this point. They're hosting their own convention. So, there's an argument that could be made that they are closer to AAA than indie now. Sure. Last Epoch is a studio that literally, that is their first game.
Yeah.
They are very much indie studio.
That's cool.
And then you've got Diablo 4, who is from Blizzard. They are the most most lauded AAA game developer for a time. Yeah. Now they are embroiled in tons of controversy. So at that point, the real thing is look for what is going to give you the most the most back, and then also look for the way that they are interacting with their community. Diablo 4, you can see that they don't really interact with their community in significantly positive ways when it comes to monetization, when it comes to conversations about how they're handling even the IP. For instance, you look at how they talked about Diablo Immortal, because that came out before Diablo 4 came out. They started talking about Diablo Immortal, and people were not happy about it. They expressed they weren't happy about it, but they kept pushing ahead without just completely ignoring their community, saying, hey, I'm not happy about this. Can we please change this? Can we do something different? This is not what we want to see from the IP that you created that we love. Like, we love this IP.
What is Diablo Immortal?
Diablo Immortal is the mobile version of Diablo. They released a mobile version, and not even a joke, at their own convention. When they announced this idea that they were going to release Diablo Immortal, one of the people who came up to the mic said, "Is this an out-of-season April Fool's joke?" To the developers.
Got him.
And the entire, not entire, but the majority of the crowd, such a overwhelming majority of the crowd, cheered that question.
Wow. Oh, man.
And the developers' answer to that was, "Do you not have phones?"
What?
Like, it's not quite exactly how that went, but the exchange was basically like they wanted to play it. Like, Diablo has been always a very much PC focused game, and their reaction to it was they don't want to play a mobile game. They were asking, hey, is this going to get ported to a PC eventually, or can we play this on PC? And their answer was, do you guys not have phones?
That's ridiculous.
Completely oblivious to the way that their core fan base.
Yeah, whoa. That's intense.
And this was people who were fans of Diablo, or not Diablo, fans of Blizzard at the time. These are people who traveled to their convention.
Oh, right.
Like, it was at BlizzCon that this happened. So, yeah, there was quite a bit of uproar from their community of, hey, we don't want this. Rather than saying, we hear you, we understand, here's what we're going to change, here's what we're going to do. They eventually walked it back and put it on PC, but they really focused on that mobile element anyways, but they didn't even create a conversation about why don't you want a mobile game?
Yeah, they weren't asking the questions of, which is kind of interesting because I can understand from the stockholder or whatever fancy term of the people that are giving the money to the company to do these things, that they would want the mobile game because then you can just transaction more easily and I don't know. But versus it being a full-fledged game where it's $60 and you buy it and you play it and there's a few DLCs here and there, where there's more care and attention to the actual game. So I can see how that was a bit like a red flag for the fans and the audience, especially ones. When was the last Diablo game released before they mentioned that Diablo?
Diablo. When was Diablo 3 released?
As well, and that's just kind of a slap in the face.
Diablo 3 was released in 2012.
Okay.
The Diablo 4 announcement was... Or the Diablo Immortal announcement, because that's the one that came first.
Yeah.
The Diablo 4 announcement came up 5 years ago, so that was 2019.
So that was quite a wait for them. To see Diablo pop up on the screen, get the anticipation, and then get the air knocked out of them. I can understand the frustration for sure.
They were very frustrated, but the reality is the developers didn't listen to them, and they were listening to the shareholders in that mobile games are making more money.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think Diablo 4 was a response to Diablo Immortal being so poor received?
No, they had already said that. They didn't already say it. They were already developing Diablo 4. A Diablo 4 announcement kind of quickly came up after the Diablo Immortal announcement.
I wonder if that was on purpose as a softener almost.
Well, and that's the crazy thing. So it could have been used as a softener because we actually saw this at a very similar event for Bethesda at the same time, where they announced Elder Scrolls 6, and I honestly think this is part of why the reception to Diablo Immortal is part of why they announced Elder Scrolls 6 so early, because they announced Elder Scrolls 6, and then they talked about Elder Scrolls Blades, which is a mobile Elder Scrolls game.
Oh boy.
Yep. So they used the announcement of Elder Scrolls 6 as a softener, saying like, "Hey, we listened. We're making the big game for your PCs, but we also want to tide you over with this mobile game." And that's how they phrased it. Like, we're going to tide you over with this mobile game too, which, again, no one really wanted.
Yeah, like, which I think is kind of funny too, because it's like you would think that like even though it makes more money hypothetically, because of other mobile games, if the fan base doesn't want it, they're not really making the money, right? Do they actually make the money back that they're expecting?
So the unfortunate surprise is they do make more money off of those mobile games.
Wow.
It typically, because there are obviously. Sorry, go ahead. What'd you say?
That's interesting.
Sorry, say that again. I couldn't quite hear
They
you.
don't buy the mobile games, guys. You're telling them that you want more of that instead of Diablo 5 with co-op couch support.
And that's the honest truth.
So how do you?
That's the honest truth.
Yeah. How do you think game controversy? Like, if it was like game of the year, but there's the most controversy around it versus employees being treated poorly with Game Crunch or some of those sexist things that were happening at Blizzard. What's your thoughts on that kind of stuff?
Okay. So regarding that, one, I'm going to start with this. I am not a game dev, so when it comes down to crunch, like I have opinions that are only based off of my opinions on labor in general and on work in general. And to start with that, I don't think that we should have to exist in a society that is necessary. Yeah. I understand that in some cases, like you have to try a little bit harder, you have to work a little bit harder. Sometimes there is a little bit of pressure, but the levels of crunch and the time frames of crunch are usually a little bit out of hand, and that's more what I have an issue with is when they go on for, like, I've heard of certain studios doing crunch for easily upwards of 6 months to like the entire development cycle of a game, which could be years they're just doing crunch for, which is usually them. Yeah, which is usually them doing 12 to ostensibly 16-hour days. Because again, I can't prove any of this. I'm not working in those studios.
I'm a studio too, but still, like, it's pretty crazy when you think about it.
But it's a lot of time and a lot of effort that's being put in, and the reality is there are a lot of other people who exist with similar skill sets, because I can't say the same because I don't know exactly everybody, but there's similar skill sets that could potentially take some of that burden away from those individuals, so that way work could be spread out more easily and less crunch could be had. Yeah. This is more of a comment on labor in general than specifically video games, but I really don't think that there needs to be crunch at least as consistently as we've seen in video games. Yeah. And then where it comes to game of the year versus studios being terrible to their employees and embroiled in controversy, we can actually look at one of the more recent game of the year games and seeing that that's not necessary. Larian Studios, a studio everyone is very excited about, that seems that everyone who's worked there has had most everyone who's worked there has had a very good experience. I'm sure that there are outliers. I'm sure that there's somebody who had a terrible experience, whether it be because of their own shortcomings or just a situation that didn't work out. Mm-hmm. But I've heard mostly to almost all good things about Larian Studios and the people who've worked there, and they got Game of the Year for Baldur's Gate 3. Yeah. And in fact, they even turned... Oh, sorry?
Oh yeah, no, I've been enjoying that game. I haven't finished it yet, but it's like one of my favorite games I've ever played, honestly. Yeah. And I'd never
and they continued
before, so it was like my first experience with pretty much all of that.
I have played Divinity, Original Sin, and Original Sin 2, which are their two sort of pre-Baldur's Gate similar CRPG style games, and you can see where they're just growing and improving and getting better with every part of their business through those 3 games, even though they're not exactly in a series. Like the first 2 are kind of like, they're easily connected, and the third one's like, well, there's some references to the other 2, but it's not actually technically even in the same world.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Oh, well, Baldur's Gate is part of Wizards of the Coast, which then comes to the other part of the whole conversation in that they actually turned to Wizards of the Coast and said that they were not going to be doing an expansion or Baldur's Gate 4 because of the constraints that they were going to be dealing with Wizards of the Coast again, which is that same thing of them being like, hey, we don't want more money, we want creative control.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's, again, where I've got a lot of respect for them.
Which is huge. Creative control is like makes or breaks some situations when you're creating games. As you can see, like what if they had the restraints on Baldur's Gate 3, but they made that great of a game. Can you imagine them with the chains off, being able to do whatever they want?
And they kind of had less restraints because Wizards of the Coast has sort of followed Games Workshop in the way that they release different aspects of their properties. So like their IPs are sliced up into little slivers, and they say, here, you can release something that involves this sliver of our product, and if you do a good job, we allow you to release more. This can be seen with Games Workshop. They released there are hundreds of what is it called? Warhammer
Oh, sure.
games, from mobile games to full games to Vermintide to Darktide, just being released constantly.
Yes.
But that's just it. They keep giving new studios just a sliver of their product, saying you can use this part of our IP. And then if they do a good job, they say, cool, you did great. Here's more of our IP. You can use more of it to make games. And that's basically the same thing that the Coast did with Larian, with Baldur's Gate 3. They said, you can use this aspect of our IP.
Yeah.
Everything else is off limits, but you can use this aspect. And if you do a good job, we'll give you more. They did a good job. They were like, cool, we want to work with you more, but we're also going to, have more say in what you do. And they're like, no, we don't want that.
Very interesting. Let's see. Do you think, why are certain video games canceled and released? Like, if they're like big plan, like I heard that like Spiral 4 was coming out as being a thing, but what do you think causes games, even if like a lot of people are interested in it, to be canceled before it's released?
So the biggest one that's currently going on is, well, typically it's using it as a write-off, which is where they, rather than slowly finding that a game has failed, like we can see with Anthem. Anthem is a good example of a game that kind of like slowly was failing, and therefore they were not making much money off of it, but they couldn't claim all of it as a loss.
Yeah.
They instead will claim the whole thing as a loss and just never release it, because it becomes one of the costs of doing business. So it's not that they're not making money by calling it a loss, but they're just losing all of the money up front.
Do you think that's
So,
better
yeah.
in the long run for them? Like to like with these early access, like what do you think of early access for games? Because it seems like if they almost like took the time and released it, like if it was back in the early 2000s, you made this game and it was complete, and then it's either good or it either does good or bad. Does that seem like it's obviously they changed it to this way for a reason? You think cost wise or not necessarily?
So that's a two-part question. So do I think this is better for them in the long run? Business-wise, according to all the people who work in those businesses, it is better for them. Personally, I see it as being a long-term detriment, because even though it's better for their books at the moment, what it does is it destroys and diminishes all of their fans' enjoyment of whatever product. You get excited about something, it gets canceled. You no longer get to be excited about it. You no longer get to be enjoying that product. It sort of, that game, that developer moves more to the background of what you're thinking about on a day-to-day basis.
Less likely to trust them again in the future too. And like
You see their announcement, and you say,
I have a great experience. I don't want to go back to this place again. So,
yeah.
something
You
to be said
could get
about
an.
that.
Oh, sorry. What was that?
I was just saying there's something to be said about that as well, like for game developers. If like there's a few studios that I won't buy games from anymore just because I've had so many bad experiences with them. I'm just like, nope.
No, and that's entirely valid, and that's what I'm saying in the long term, which is it's one of those things that becomes very difficult to parse exactly which is better or which is worse, because they could release the game, it could fail, and economically that could be very bad for them, but by canceling it right away, they're able to sort of recoup some of those losses in not having to pay as high taxes that year. That means the studio gets to stick around longer, but at the cost of burning their fans, which in the short term, that seems like a small price to pay. But the reality is, as often is the case with people, there's a limit to how much people are willing to endure till eventually they just kind of snap and say, no more.
Yeah.
And then the line that they draw of what is okay and what is not moves forward. It doesn't actually move back, it moves forward, and instead they say, I'm not going to deal with that even more so now.
Yeah. What do you think about games never being fully released, like in patches,
The early access question.
and stitching, and what do you think of that versus like the old games where you can like get if you figure out a glitch in the game to get infinite money, that you get to use that for the next 10 years, like what do you think about that?
So I'm of a few different minds of this. So first, I'm going to tackle the early access part of the question because that was the second part of that two-parter question that I kind of avoided initially.
Yeah.
So, oh, go ahead.
No, yeah, I was agreeing with you.
Okay, so early access. My opinions on early access is early access for the games industry as a whole is a net benefit. Mm-hmm. Typically, early access, and the best way I've seen it used is enabling a studio that doesn't have the funds or doesn't have the metrics for a particular game to be fully developed to get that hype around them as well as to get the money to actually finish a game. Oftentimes, we see games that do get abandoned in early access where they've gotten started, there's something there, but it's not really, it never makes it over the line. It never quite finishes, which is unfortunate. I think, again, as a net overall, it's still worth it. I think that as a player, the mindset you have to have with early access is that you're supporting the developer, you're supporting the idea of the game, because even if that game doesn't get released, that specific one, know that that means that other people will see that there's an interest for a game like that.
That's a good point.
And that might get developed in the future. Mm-hmm. The part that I warn is that money that you're putting in, you have to understand, could be lost. Yeah. The way you kind of have to look at it is you aren't buying yourself a game in the future, you're supporting that developer to try and finish this dream game, this ideal game that you're picturing, and that what is released may not be what you like, may not be what you want, and may end up being never released. The best benefit is that you bought yourself a gift in the future. Yeah. Totally. Great examples of games that use early access really well. Baldur's Gate 3 is also still there, where they were an early access title. Mm-hmm.
Valheim was pretty
Then there was Valheim. Valheim is another good example. But the biggest ones there are and Satisfactory, which recently came out. The biggest thing there that I would say for players who are thinking about buying an early access game or an early access title, but are unsure, on the fence, they know that they have to be cautious. Look at how the developer communicates with their fans, communicates with their community. If they're active in their community and the communications are very positive, that's a very good sign. Valheim constantly communicated with their fans, talked about what they were going to be doing next, said, hey, this is what we're planning, hey, this is what we're doing. It doesn't always have to be, this is the perfect timeline of how we're going to do things. It doesn't have to always be about what's coming next, but more just conversations about what is going on, mm-hmm. and make sure that those conversations are positive between the fans and the developers. If they're not positive, usually that's a pretty bad sign that something's not quite right.
I think it's pretty cool too, because in a way it's almost like you're like helping shape the sculpture as it's being built. So in a way, like when it comes to early access games and the people the companies and the employees that actually listen, you're almost creating this cool experience that naturally wouldn't happen unless you were working at the studio yourself.
Yeah. You kind of get to be a little bit of the idea guy in a video game studio, because there's not really an idea guy at a video game studio, but you gotta kind of be in that role when you're participating in an early access community. You're a one voice among, usually a few thousand, 100,000, but you still get to mention some things that then a dev might pick up and say, hey, this is interesting.
Yeah, totally.
But that then gets us into the unfortunate other side of that question, where it is, there are plenty of examples that you can also pull where the game never made it across the finish line, never was completed, or was just a complete scam. Mm-hmm. These are going to happen.
I know what the game is called, but I remember my ex was super excited about it. It was like the space game. or something, and there was like millions and millions of dollars that was put into this game, and it's still not
Star
released
Citizen,
yet.
perhaps?
What is it?
Star Citizen?
That's what it is. Yes, yes. Do you think that's a scam, or do you think that's real? And that might be kind of
Um,
answering the question a little bit too. But like, can you imagine
so
like putting millions of dollars into a game and it's not even released yet? Like, that's like basically the sales you probably expect from it. Maybe if it did really well, I can't imagine that in just development alone for a like because it's a
I
studio that's
hesitate.
never made a game before, correct? I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
it's a new studio. I
Yeah.
hesitate to directly call it a scam
Okay.
because I don't. I think that they are trying to produce this ideal game that they're really working on. Like they've shown some technical demos that show off some pretty impressive feats with their engine that they're building.
Yeah.
And building an engine is going to take way more time and way more effort and way more money
That's
than
true.
building just a direct game.
Yeah.
However, where I have a problem is they're selling the things that they're selling aren't just you buy the game and therefore you can interact with whatever early access stuff exists, but they're selling in-game microtransactions already that are absurdly expensive. Like there are stores that you can unlock by spending certain amounts of money in that again in that store because you can't actually buy it in the game. You're buying it for the game, but as soon as you spend like $10,000 in their store, not in-game store, in their pre-game store, it unlocks a larger store that allows you to buy things more expensive, and that's after $10,000.
This
This is where I have
for
a
like
problem.
CEOs or something. This isn't for the natural man or woman. Like it sounds like.
It's and this is where I have a problem with microtransactions too. The focus isn't about, oh, you get to spend a little bit of money to help support a developer. This is where you can tell you're not spending a little bit of money to help the developer. They're just trying to milk you for whatever money that they can.
Yeah.
Is when you can spend absurd amounts of money on things that are usually will allow you to progress through the game quicker because that means the game itself is usually not always but usually bad. If a game allows you to buy faster access, faster progression, that usually means that the progression or the access of the game is artificially limited or artificially bad.
Yeah.
Meaning that they want to make that problem so you enjoy it just enough that you want more, but at a better pace, and they say, cool, pay us money and we'll make that happen.
Sounds like a bit of an addiction there.
Yeah, well, so I know that there are in I think it is the DSRM 5. They did list game addiction as a medical thing, but I hesitate to call it a medical thing. I would more say it's more a game compulsion because no one really has withdrawals from not playing video
Yeah,
games,
yeah, that's true.
but we are compelled to play them because
Very.
it's something we fully created with the idea that we want to make it enjoyable. We want to make it something that people want to interact with.
That's a good point. Yeah, you don't really have withdrawal that I've experienced, or like I've had friends like many different ages across many different. They all play different games. Never heard of game withdrawal ever. Maybe VR in the future, but I don't know. I don't know about right now.
Maybe. And there are potentially edge cases where somebody does have withdrawal, but I think more on the general populace. I don't think it really, for me personally, I don't feel it reaches that level where it is more a compulsion that we are poorly equipped to deal with because it is something so new almost in our society where we haven't ever been able to create experiences, like wholly create experiences that people just want to interact with.
Yeah.
That is something new to our society. It's the same thing with social media where we're creating an experience, so we're completely curating this experience as something you want to do, you want to interact with.
Yeah.
And that's something new for our stupid monkey brains slash very, very, very limited lizard brains to deal with. Because usually that's what we go to as mammals. We want to interact with the things that we enjoy, and now we've created something that is designed for us to enjoy it.
Yeah. A thing I like about video games too, and that I've always kind of liked since I was younger, is that it like transports you to another place. It's very like involved, and you just kind of like can just like fully immerse yourself into it and enjoy a story or enjoy a certain mechanic, and it's a way to bond with other people, especially if you're a dork in school and you have a hard time making friends. It's a great way to kind of meet other friends and have commonalities that way. So that's been kind of a beautiful thing in my life that I've experienced with video games.
Absolutely, and that's why I hesitate to try and sort of impugn the general sense around video games of being a positive with this idea that it is an addictive thing. I don't personally think that it is inherently addictive. I think that we are poorly equipped to deal with the fact that it is an experience that is curated to be enjoyable and for us to actually want to interact with. Usually, I mean, in general life.
Too. You can almost
sorry, go ahead.
to anything in life too. Like it's all about moderation and self-control and, you know, like that kind of stuff, and just kind of finding the gray area that works for you.
Yes, exactly.
So when would you put money into like a Kickstarter or an early access game? How do you know that? Is it just you're just going to roll the dice, or do you wait a few years to see? Because even with that, would you say Star Citizen, like that's been several years and millions of dollars, and I still, from the bits that you told me, I'd still just be like, I'm just going to hold my wallet over here, you know?
That is honestly my recommendation with Star Citizen. Again, not because I don't think that they're trying to do something. Like, it sounds like, from what I've seen, the developers are actually trying to make something pretty incredible. Yeah. And that's impressive. Yeah. I'm glad for them, but it hasn't ever reached the point where I would put my support into it. And then the fact that they are selling in-game advantages already before the game is even released to the tune of over $10,000. I'm not
gonna lie, like when I hear in-game advantages for dollars, I get exhausted. I'm immediately turned off. Like immediately just like, okay, next, different game. Like, I don't know if that's just for like, is that just because we're used to games? Like, what do you think about like the younger generation, like Gen Z or below? Do you think that they're used to, like they would be like more inclined? Are we just old, or like, you know?
The studies show that they are.
Interesting.
The studies show that it is more common for them to interact with those styles of monetization because that is something that they've grown up with. Yeah. For instance, you brought up that you grew up playing games. The first game that I ever played, first games that I ever played were Wolfenstein 3D, which you had to boot up your computer in DOS to play it. Nice. And I think it was Seventh Guest, or maybe it was Seventh Ghost, something like that, which was a murder mystery. And both of those were, in comparison, very limited experiences, but also were ones that you bought it, and then you had it, and that was it.
Yes.
Like that, there was no expansions. If there was an expansion, it wasn't actually an expansion, it was just a sequel. They couldn't install additional points onto it.
Yes.
And now, growing up through seeing expansions be the big thing with, like, StarCraft Brood War, Command and Conquer to Command and Conquer Red Alert, or rather, Command and Conquer Red Alert to Command and Conquer Red Alert, whatever expansion, Yuri's Revenge, that's the one it was called, which was adding content into the already existing game. To then, beyond that, where we get to Oblivion and its horse armors. Which was adding content, but it was content that didn't actually have any sort of real gameplay value. It was a texture. You got to buy a texture pack.
See, that's what I feel like. If it's like genuinely improving the game, and I'm not just talking about like you release a broken game day one and you patch it 50 times to make it work how it should have worked day one for $60, but I mean like genuine like updates that are like really, really cool. And I think it's really cool when developers do it for free. I'm not saying they have to, but like I just like it just kind of shows that they're like really like, thank you for enjoying our game so much. Here's this. Or like with Elden Ring, I've never played Elden Ring. I know it's like so popular and super cool, and I know how hyped my friends are about the DLC and how much time they've spent in the world. And like to me, like I'd be like, oh yeah, that DLC seems like it's worth it because they put so much time and effort into it, and it seems like it's worth the cost. It was worth the extra effort if it's worth the extra effort for them to even make it in the first place and for someone to want to consume it, I feel like that's the perfect little triangle, you know, where instead of it just being like Skyrim Legends or whatever you called it, and here, just pay us a bunch of money for this crappy game, give us our money. You know, like it just, I don't know, I feel like it needs to be more harmonious that way in order for me to be interested in the DLC or the patches.
No, and I absolutely agree. And for examples of them giving patches or giving not necessarily content. Like you can see it as two different things. They can either support the game and give it patches in order to update, just improve small things, which I do think is important in today's world of gaming. Mm-hmm. I feel like consistent support is actually important after a game is released. Mm-hmm. To not to harp too hard on the same game, but Baldur's Gate 3 released patch 7 most recently, which that is 7 patches after they released it, where they're not actually gaining any, like, they're not gaining any more money by doing each of these patches. They could have just released it, given, as soon as it's in a working condition, not done any patches, and left it alone. But by doing those patches, it's the exact opposite, actually, of the thing I was saying earlier about a company deciding that they wanted to burn a game in order to make more money now, or not make more money now, in order to lose less money now. Mm-hmm. By burning the game, it burns the fans. Those fans don't want to buy the games anymore. It ruins the long term for the company. This is the exact opposite, where they release these patches for free. Yeah. It builds up more interest in that studio. It builds more of a beneficial culture between the devs and the players. Mm-hmm. And again, not to harp too much on the games that I like, but Path of Exile is another great example of this. Path of Exile, completely free, and it has been releasing new leagues basically every 3 months for the past, I think it's like 6 or 8 years. Wow. And this is just what they continuously do. They just continuously release new stuff, new content. And again, all that content, 100% free. Yeah. They never have charged anything to play it. That's crazy. They just have cosmetic microtransactions that that I am compelled to pay hundreds of dollars to this company for.
Well, you're getting something from the experience. You're getting something from putting the money into it. That's what I feel like. I feel like it has to be like a relationship, like a literal relationship between instead of them just taking something and us just taking something, we're mutually getting something out of both parties, from the company and the consumer.
And that's where I do think that style of business, where you're burning content in order to lose less money, is actually extremely negative in the world of gaming. Yes. Because players will see that and they will start to avoid your company, your product, and then they will start to be more attracted to other companies who don't do that to them, who don't promise them something and then burn it for a tax write-off instead.
Absolutely. What do you think about bigger companies buying little companies for gaming stuff? Like when Blizzard's just picking up all these little companies.
In one way, I very much understand wanting to have your studio have that backing, have that monetary backing, so that way you can release what you believe is the best product. Mm-hmm. The unfortunate reality of it, I think, is a general negative for the gaming community, in that where we see a lot, especially recently, where we see a lot of the biggest games are more from indie studios or indie adjacent studios, AA studios, which it's kind of a misnomer, but we're just going to go with it. AA studios. One of my favorite things to list is, and it's unfortunate because we see a negative here, but there are publishers who will focus on publishing from very small indie studios. One of my favorites was Annapurna Interactive, where they were publishing games. Stray.
Oh no, they were bought.
They weren't bought, but their entire gaming division just recently resigned.
Oh no, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that was so sad for me.
It is really sad, because there's a lot of really cool stuff, and this is what I'm saying. Like they supported a lot of indie developers to get them over into everyone's hearts. Because then there's also Outer Wilds was another one they released, which anyone who's played Outer Wilds absolutely loves it. And then another one that I recently just played that I really loved was Cocoon. It's kind of in that similar vein, but you see how they built up this idea behind their games, the games that they attract and develop, and then unfortunately in this case they burned their dev team, which this is where crunch gets you, is burning your dev team. In this case, I don't think it was actually crunch, and I think it was a creative disagreement, an actual creative disagreement. Okay. But the whole point being, they avoided avoided being bought, but I think that all of the games they were releasing were fantastic games, and they didn't need to be a larger studio to release those games.
Yeah.
And those games are games that everyone who played them, not everyone, I guess most people who played them, absolutely loved. These are games that had overwhelming Steam reviews,
Yes.
games that were just beloved, and now, unfortunately, because of the falling out between their game department and the actual publisher, we're going to unfortunately not see that anymore.
Dev is a publisher?
That was a publisher. Annapurna Interactive was the publisher for Stray, not necessarily the developer for Stray.
Why couldn't they get a different publisher and just keep making games?
They might be able to get another publisher. The problem there is now we get into the legal issues of ownership. The reality is that Annapurna might have some sort of contract that retains some level of ownership or creative rights, or even right of first refusal for Stray 2, or whatever that studio comes up with next.
I wonder if they would just be better for, because it seemed like all the games they were making were separate experiences. Like they didn't seem like they were interconnecting. So maybe if they had the funds or the ability to finding another publisher and just making another great game the way that they do.
And that's a possibility. What I was saying is, again, like Annapurna was more of an example of you can find a publisher that helps you release whatever smaller games you're releasing. You don't necessarily need a publisher, though, because there's also plenty of indie games that don't have publishers. Okay. So,
Oh, I was just, this is new to me. I noticed the difference between like a company and a publisher, but I hadn't really thought about it. So this is kind of interesting to kind of learn about.
Well, that's entirely fair. But like you've got games that have been wild, just runaway successes that haven't had like a big publisher behind them. For example, one of the bigger ones more recently was Lethal Company.
Okay, yeah, I've heard of that.
Yeah, and almost everyone has. That was basically a single developer who made that by themselves, and I think he may have had like 2 people work on it with him or had help from, but I think for the majority of it, it was just one person. This is not a general assessment on fully what he did, because again, I did not look into his studio specifically for this. But I know that it was a very small team, if it was a team at all, if it wasn't just one person. And yet it was a runaway success to the extent where he has made a very genuinely healthy profit from that. But the focus shouldn't be on that. It should be more on the fact that he didn't need a publisher. He didn't need to be a big studio. All he needed was a concept of a game that was very compelling. The just base compelling aspects of his game were what he focused on from what I can tell. I don't think it was a big thing that he was making the best graphics or the best... Like, he did a good job on what he made, but his focus was the compelling gameplay loop. And I honestly think that's where we see a lot of other bigger games, bigger studios get off track. They look to make... They lose focus on the actual gameplay loop, the experience of the player, and focus on other things that are maybe less necessary, like, say... For example, graphics, which everyone likes good graphics, but graphics are icing on a cake.
Yes.
As much as they are great, no one wants just a tube of icing.
I don't know.
I'm sure there's somebody else. But more or less, if we're talking about icing on a cake,
yeah, totally.
The cake itself has to be good.
Yes, absolutely. So like, it's interesting that you mentioned graphics, because graphics are getting so crazy now. I feel like I have to keep. I mean, you always have to keep updating your PC if you want to keep playing modern gaming. But it's like to the point where I'm like, where does it go from here? Almost it's like we're almost focusing on the graphics too much versus like gameplay. Do you also get the same sense as well?
There is a little worry in me that we are focusing on graphics a little bit too much, while simultaneously also trying to focus on making things that are relying on future advancement more so than what we currently have. And by what we currently have, I don't mean what is the current top-end PC. I mean what is currently the largest market share style PC. Because while I have a great PC myself, and that is fantastic for me, I know plenty of people who have told me in certain circumstances on my stream that they can't play the game that I'm playing because it requires too much too much of a system that they don't have access to, which that complaint has become more widespread lately. And the reason I say that it's more of an issue that we're trying to make these games for the highest end PCs or for PCs that may not even quite exist yet is actually if we look at games like Crysis, where Crysis actually made their game in a way that was focused on the way technology was developing at the time. It's a funny joke that, can it run Crysis? But the reality is there are a lot of computers today that would struggle running Crysis because we changed how we were building those computers. We moved away from more cores, or we moved away from faster cores to more cores when we were building CPUs, which means that Crysis is no longer really going to be optimized for any system because we're no longer making the tech that they had so heavily invested in designing their game around. They thought, oh, well, eventually people will be able to play this because this is how tech is advancing.
Oh yeah, that's
When
a
trying to predict
game though, because like you really never know unless you're like super high up there and one of the 8 people that rule the world. You probably, I'm just kidding. You probably don't know like how technology is going to go. That's just kind of how nature is too, you know?
I would say no one can predict, even those 8 people, quote unquote. No, I would say no one really knows how technology will ever advance. And in this case, Crysis was at the detriment for it because that question, that joke still crops up today where, but could it run Crysis? And most people say, no, it couldn't. It's the same thing that we're seeing now with graphics cards. And this is sort of coming back to that graphics question, sort of in preparation for wrapping up. We're seeing a lot of those graphics start to rely on things like upscaling, as opposed to upscaling, ray tracing, as opposed to what exists right now. So like upscaling is the process of where
I hear that all of the time. What is ray tracing? Why is it so fancy?
So ray tracing is basically it traces rays of light and sort of like their reflections on different surfaces to try and better emulate real life. Like if you imagine the sun is in the sky, its light is going this way, it's hitting these things, it diffuses off of that into these different directions. Ray tracing is sort of the same process, but for graphics cards. It's a little more advanced than that. This is very much a simplification of it, but it's that same idea.
Okay.
Creating that light diffusion through a specific light source and how it would react off of different surfaces. Yeah. Again, very rough outline on how it works. Then we're also seeing we're also seeing upscaling be used a lot, which is where basically you take a lower resolution, or wait, is it? I'll have to look this one up. Sorry, upscaling is one I'm not as familiar with, but I forget the direction it goes. If it's using a lower, I think it's using a higher resolution image, and then you scale it down to the actual resolution of the monitor, whatever you're using, so that way it looks better.
Okay, that makes sense.
And I'm just double checking that that's exactly how it works. So. Okay. Upscaling converts low-resolution material, often video or images, into higher definition. So it's basically just using a low-resolution image and upgrading it to a higher-resolution image artificially. So it's not using an actually higher-resolution image, which requires less on a particular device. So like that, they would require less processing because it's not as high resolution. But creating it as a natively high-resolution image means that it's rendering all of that image as opposed to rendering a smaller snippet of the image, or not snippet, a smaller version of the image, and then making it look better, making it look bigger, rather.
Okay.
So.
That makes sense.
But did you have any other questions before we wrap up, or?
Yeah, maybe just like one more. What do you think makes something become an industry standard?
And we're talking about in the monetization, or are we talking about in the technology of it?
Either or.
I guess I'll answer both. With monetization, what usually makes the industry standard is, unfortunately, what makes the most money. This is why we're seeing that move to more microtransactions, more mobile games, because those are what are leading in monetization, in bringing in money through monetization. We're seeing microtransactions make more money than a standard game price. Because even for the thing where I say that I love Path of Exile, I paid for Diablo 4. I paid $70 for it. I don't think I paid for anything more on it, and I may never pay anything more for it. Path of Exile, I've spent upwards of like $300 to $400 on it, and I'll probably spend another couple $100 of it on it again later on. And this, I'm not even like a whale in their opinion, but the whole point being is for that game where technically it's a free game, I've spent more on it than I spent on Diablo 4.
Yeah, totally.
Which, that's a great evidence for microtransactions work, especially if you're doing them right. Yeah. The honest solution that we should see for gamers is that we should need to focus on how we're spending our money in microtransactions, what we're actually receiving for those things. Not you need to receive the most for your buck, but you should be supporting the studio more so than getting some sort of advantage. And what you should be getting should be worthwhile to some degree. It should not be that you are spending money to skip content or skip the game, skip grinding, because that means that the game design is a poor philosophy. More so it should be that you're getting something that you can enjoy within the game that doesn't break the game.
Yes, absolutely.
Then on technology, what usually makes the industry standards is honestly, again, it comes down to what ends up working. We end up seeing games that have higher resolution graphics be the focus right now. It's moving away from that lately, but we saw it be the focus for so long because that was what sold games. People saw the best graphics they've ever seen, and they would immediately be like, that's a game that I want to get, that's an experience I want to have, it's a world that looks so real, it's been rendered to such a degree. And the reality is the gameplay wasn't the focus because it's much harder to sell someone on an experience that they haven't experienced.
That's actually a really good point.
Than it is to sell them on what something looks like.
Because you can see what it looks like before you buy it and be like, whoa, but you can't necessarily package an experience until you experience it yourself.
Yep.
Interesting.
Which is where I'd love to see a resurgence in demos.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that'd be a great cross path between being able to try it without having to spend all the money on it.
Well, I think that I hope that answered most of the questions.
Yeah,
I know there were a few that I kind of got a little bit distracted with tangents or side options.
Yeah, it was great. Yeah, very, very informative.
All right. Well, cool. With that, I guess thank you all for tuning in, listening. And if you guys have questions or conversations you want us to maybe talk about or think about for next time, let us know.
Sounds great. All right. Bye, guys.